The shuttle came apart in the sky like a toy thrown by an angry child. Ilara Vasquez pressed her face against the window and watched the wing rip away from the body of the ship and spin into the clouds below, and she screamed. But nobody could hear her, because everyone else was screaming too. The evacuation transport had taken off from Colony Station Verith 7 only 15 minutes ago, and already the engines were failing and the hull was cracking, and the pilot was shouting words into the radio that a 6-year-old girl was not supposed to understand. Ilara did not understand them, but she understood the fear in his voice, and that was enough. The ship hit the jungle canopy at an angle, and the world became noise and light and pain, and then darkness. When she opened her eyes, she was alone. She was lying on wet dirt at the bottom of a ravine, and the sky above her was a thin strip of orange and purple through the treetops, and the air smelled like burning metal. And something sweet she could not name. Her arm hurt, and her head hurt, and her dress was torn and muddy, and she could hear strange sounds in the jungle around her, clicking and buzzing in the slow drip of water from leaves that glowed a soft blue-green in the fading light. She sat up and looked around, and saw pieces of the shuttle scattered across the ravine floor, broken panels and twisted metal, and a large cargo pod that had rolled down the slope and come to rest against a fallen tree. There were no other people. She called out for her mother, and her voice echoed off the rocks and came back to her empty and small, and that was when she started to cry. She cried for a long time because she was 6 years old, and she was alone on an alien planet, and the jungle was getting darker, and the sounds were getting louder, and she did not know what to do. Eventually she stopped crying, because crying was not helping, and because she was very cold, and she thought that maybe there was a blanket or something warm inside the cargo pod. She walked to it on shaking legs, and found that the side panel had cracked open during the crash, and she pulled at it with her small hands until it bent enough for her to squeeze through. Inside the pod, it was dark, but warmer than outside, and she could see shapes in the dim light, supply crates and equipment cases, and in the back corner, a large metal carrier with words stamped on its side in bold red letters. Terran Fauna, Biodefense Unit K9-NB7, Colonial Defense Corps, handle with caution. The carrier was dented, and the lock mechanism on the front was broken and hanging loose, and from inside came a sound, a low, rough breathing, like something alive and something angry. Ilara froze. She thought about all the stories her mother had told her about the dangerous animals on colony worlds, the 6-legged lizards, and the flying things with too many teeth, and the worms that lived underground and could swallow a grown man whole. But then she heard the breathing change, and it became softer, and there was a small whimper mixed in with it, like whatever was inside was hurt. Ilara was 6 years old, and she was afraid of many things, but she had never been able to ignore something that sounded like it was in pain. She reached out and pulled the broken lock free, and swung the carrier door open and looked inside. A pair of small, dark eyes looked back at her. The creature was about the size of a large cat, but built like a small bear, with thick legs and a wide, flat head, and a coat of coarse fur that was dark on the bottom and silver-white on top. And it had long, curved claws and a blunt snout, and it looked at her with an expression that she could only describe as deeply annoyed. It was not a lizard or a flying thing or a worm. It looked like a funny dog. "Hi," Ilara whispered. The animal, a honey badger, though Ilara did not know this, stepped out of the carrier slowly and sniffed the air, and then sniffed her hand, and then sniffed her face, and she giggled because its nose was wet and cold. His name was Sergeant Whiskey, though he had no way of telling her this, and he was not a normal honey badger, because normal honey badgers did not exist on colony worlds in the far reaches of human space. He was a product of the Terran Colonial Defense Corps bioengineering program, gene-enhanced for intelligence and resilience and aggression, and fitted with a subdermal distress beacon and a micro-armor weave beneath his thick fur. And he had been bred and trained for one purpose, and one purpose only: to protect. His carrier had been damaged in the crash, and his briefing handler was nowhere in his scent range. And his internal conditioning protocols were cycling through options: assess threat level, identify terrain, locate nearest human asset to guard. And there she was, small and shivering, and smelling like fear and blood and the recycled air of a human ship. She was Pac. That was enough. Whiskey pressed his stocky body against her legs, and she laughed a little through her tears, and sat down on the floor of the cargo pod, and he climbed into her lap, which was really too small for him. But he did not care, and she wrapped her arms around him and buried her face in his coarse fur. "You smell bad," she told him, and he did not care about that either. She found an emergency blanket in one of the supply crates, thin and silver and crinkly, and she wrapped it around both of them, and leaned against the wall of the cargo pod, and Whiskey lay across her legs like a warm, heavy stone. Outside, the jungle was fully dark now, and the bioluminescent plants cast the ravine in shades of blue and green, and the sounds of alien creatures filled the air, chirps and clicks and distant howls that made Alara pull the blanket tighter. "I want my mom," whispered into Whiskey's fur. He did not answer because he could not, but he pressed closer to her, and his warmth was steady and real. Far above them, far beyond the clouds and the atmosphere and the thin shell of sky, the Vrethkai patrol fleet hung in orbit like a crown of dark metal around the planet. They were insectoid creatures, tall and armored, with compound eyes and mandibles that clicked when they spoke, and they had come to Verit 7 for the same reason they came to every human frontier world: slaves. The colony had been hit fast, and the orbital defenses had crumbled, and the evacuation had been desperate and incomplete. And now the Vrethkai were sweeping the surface for survivors. A sensor officer on the lead ship detected the crash signature in the southern jungle, and flagged it for ground retrieval. "Biosigns," the officer reported to Subcommander Skirix, who stood at the tactical display with his forearms folded behind his back. "One small human and one unknown animal." Skirix clicked his mandibles in something like amusement. "Send a patrol," he said. 12 should be more than enough for one child and a pet." He turned back to his display and thought nothing more of it. In the ravine below, Alara had fallen asleep with her cheek pressed against Whiskey's back, and her breathing was slow and even and peaceful. Whiskey was not asleep. His ears rotated slowly, left, then right, then left again, and his nostrils flared as he pulled scent from the night air and sorted it into categories, the way his enhanced brain had been built to do. Trees and water, and fungal spores, and the musk of native predators keeping their distance. And something else. Something new. Something that smelled like chitin, and ozone, and metal, and wrong. His lips pulled back from his teeth just slightly, and a sound built in his chest. Not quite a growl, and not quite a warning, but something older, deeper than both P. He did not move from Alara's lap. Not yet. Whiskey waited until the child's breathing was deep and steady, and then he moved. He slid out from under her small arms with a care that would have surprised anyone who knew what honey badgers were built to do, and he paused at the edge of the cargo pod, and looked back at her once, just once, to confirm she was still and safe and warm. Then he went to work. The jungle at night on Verit 7 was alive in ways that most worlds were not, and every leaf and vine and root pulsed with a faint blue-green glow that made the darkness feel like the bottom of a strange ocean. And things moved between the trees, things with too many legs and too many eyes, and sounds that did not belong to any world humans had come from. Whiskey did not care about any of them. He moved low and fast through the undergrowth, with his belly close to the dirt, and his claws barely whispering against the ground, and he began to circle. First a tight loop, 20 meters out from the cargo pod where Alara slept, and then a wider one at 30 meters and then 50, and with each pass he was reading the terrain the way a soldier reads a battlefield. Here the ground was soft and wet, and would not hold weight well, and a heavy creature stepping wrong would sink to its knees. Here a thorn thicket grew in a dense wall. The thorns were long and black, and coated in something that made the air smell sharp and chemical, and even the native animals avoided it. Here a cluster of fungal pods grew on a dead log, fat and pale, and when Whiskey nosed one gently, it burst with a soft hiss, and released a cloud of spores that burned his nostrils and made his eyes water, and he memorized its position and moved on. Here the ground dropped away into a narrow sinkhole hidden by a mat of roots and vines, and a creature walking this path without knowing would fall 3 meters into loose rock and mud. He was not thinking in words, because honey badgers do not think in words, not even gene-enhanced ones, but he was thinking in patterns and spaces and threat lines and safe zones, and the math of violence that had been coded into his DNA by scientists who understood that the best defense was not a wall, but a maze that punished every step. He scent-marked as he went, quick bursts from his musk glands on tree trunks and rocks, and at every natural choke point, not to warn the enemy away, but to track them when they came, because they would come, and he knew this the way he knew gravity and hunger and the need to keep the small sleeping thing behind him alive. On his third loop, he found the lizard. It was one of the native ambush predators, a 6-legged thing the size of a large dog, with flat camouflage scales and a mouth full of backward-curving teeth, and it was crouched on a low branch above one of the paths that led toward the cargo pod, and it was waiting with the patient stillness of something that killed for a living. He came up the back side of the tree trunk without a sound, and when the lizard sensed him and turned its head, he was already inside its guard. His jaws closed on the soft place where its skull met its spine, and he bit down with a force that cracked bone and cartilage like dry wood. The lizard spasmed once and went limp. He let it fall to the ground with a heavy, wet thud. He stood on the branch for a moment and licked the blood from his mow and listened to the jungle go quiet around him, every creature within earshot recognizing what that sound meant and deciding to be somewhere else. Good. He dragged the lizard's body off the path and left it in the undergrowth and continued his patrol. 40 minutes later, he returned to the cargo pod and slipped back inside, and Alara stirred in her sleep and opened her eyes halfway and saw him standing there with dirt on his snout and leaf matter in his fur and something dark staining his chest. SP. "You're so messy," she mumbled with a sleepy smile, and reached out and pulled him close, and he let her because she was warm, and because the sound of her heartbeat was the metronome his entire nervous system was calibrated to protect. She was asleep again in seconds. He lay beside her, with his chin on her ankle, and his ears turning and turning and turning. 2 kilometers to the north, Sub-Commander Skirix led his patrol through the jungle in a standard sweep formation, 2 scouts forward and 2 flankers wide, and the rest in a staggered column behind, and they moved with the clicking mechanical precision of a species that had been waging war across 12 star systems for longer than humans had been traveling between them. The Vrethkai were tall, nearly 2 meters, and their bodies were encased in natural chitin armor, supplemented by tactical plating on their joints and thorax, and they carried plasma lances that hummed with a low electric whine. Their compound eyes saw in spectrums that most species could not imagine. They were not afraid of the jungle. They were not afraid of anything on this planet. "The crash site is 1.6 kilometers ahead," the lead scout reported through the comm channel built into its mandible structure. "Biosigns unchanged, 1 juvenile human and 1 small animal." "Retrieval only," Skirix confirmed. "The child may have value in the labor markets, and the animal is irrelevant. Kill it if it interferes." One of the flankers made a clicking sound that was the Vrethkai equivalent of a chuckle. Humans and their pets, it said. They bring animals everywhere, even to worlds that are trying to kill them. Sentimental species, another soldier agreed. They bond with everything. Dogs and cats and birds and rodents and fish. I once saw a human cry over a dead plant. It is a weakness, Skirix said flatly, and weakness is why they lose. They moved on, through the glowing jungle, and the sounds of their passage, the click of chitin on stone, and the hum of their weapons, and the rustle of their armored legs through the undergrowth, traveled ahead of them like a wave. Whiskey heard them long before they arrived. He lifted his head from Alara's ankle, and his nostrils flared, and the scent hit him like a wall, chitin and ozone, and something acrid and chemical. That was the Vrethkai equivalent of sweat, and it was not one scent, but many, 12 distinct sources moving in a pattern that even his animal brain recognized as a hunting formation. He looked at Alara. She was curled on her side with the silver blanket pulled up to her chin, and her lips were slightly parted, and her breathing was the slow, deep rhythm of a child who had cried herself to exhaustion and found comfort in the warmth of something alive beside her. He looked at the entrance of the cargo pod. At her. Something shifted behind his dark eyes. Not thought exactly, and not decision exactly, but something that lived in the space between instinct and intention. And he pressed his nose against her hand one last time, and then he turned and walked out of the cargo pod and into the night. The lead Vrethkai scout entered Whiskey's outer perimeter 17 minutes later, and the first thing it noticed was the scent mark on a tree trunk, a sharp, musky smell that made its antenna twitch with discomfort. It paused and scanned the area with its compound eyes, and saw nothing and heard nothing, and its tremor sense, the ability to feel vibrations through the ground, picked up only the faint, steady pulse of a small heartbeat somewhere ahead. The child. It reported the scent mark to Skirix, who dismissed it as territorial marking from a native animal, and ordered the advance to continue. The scout moved forward, and its armored legs crunched softly on the leaf. Litter, and it did not see the shape crouched in the shadow of a root cluster 3 meters to its left. Whiskey was perfectly still, perfectly silent, perfectly furious. And the night was only beginning. The first Vrethkai soldier died without understanding what had happened to it. The point scout was moving through a narrow gap between 2 large boulders when something dropped from above. Something small and fast and impossibly heavy for its size, and landed directly on the back of its head. And before the scout could raise its plasma lance or activate its comm, or even turn its compound eyes upward, there were jaws clamped on the soft membrane between its helmet plate and its neck chitin. And those jaws bit down with a force that should not have been possible from a creature that weighed 12 kilograms. The scout made a sound, a high thin whistle, that was the Vrethkai equivalent of a scream. And then it made no sound at all. It collapsed forward onto the rocks, and the thing that had killed it was already gone, vanished into the undergrowth like smoke. The second scout found the body 9 seconds later, and the alarm went up through the patrol like a flare. Electricity through water. Contact, Skirix barked. Formation tight, weapons hot. What killed it? Unknown, the second scout reported, and its voice carried something that Vrethkai voices were not supposed to carry. Uncertainty. The neck membrane is torn through, bite marks. The wound pattern suggests a small predator, but the force is, Subcommander, the force is not consistent with anything small. Find it, Skirix ordered. They tried. The patrol reformed into a defensive cluster and began sweeping the area around the first kill, with their plasma lances raised and their compound eyes scanning every shadow and every branch and every gap between the rocks. And they found nothing, because Whiskey was already 60 meters away, circling back through terrain he had memorized hours ago. He came at them from the east this time. 2 soldiers had moved slightly ahead of the group to check a clearing, and Whiskey drove them, not with direct attack, but with noise and movement. crashing through a bush to their left, then appearing briefly on a rock to their right. And they turned and fired, and their plasma bolts hit trees and dirt and empty air, and in their confusion they backed into the thorn thicket. The thorns were 15 centimeters long and coated in a chemical irritant that the native plants used to discourage herbivores. And when the thorns punched through the gaps in the soldiers' tactical plating, the chemical hit their exposed tissue like liquid fire, and they screamed and thrashed, and the more they thrashed, the deeper the thorns drove in. And by the time their squad mates cut them free, both soldiers were on the ground, alive but shaking, and blind in 3 of their 5 eye clusters, and completely out of the fight. Skirix was beginning to understand that something was wrong. This was not random animal aggression, and this was not a territorial predator defending its hunting ground. This was systematic, deliberate, and whatever was doing it knew the terrain better than his soldiers did, and it was using that knowledge like a weapon. "Pull back to the ridge," he ordered. "Regroup and use thermal scanning." They pulled back, and the thermal scan showed a small, warm shape moving through the undergrowth 70 meters to the south, fast and low, and then it vanished behind a rock formation and did not reappear. "There," a soldier said and pointed, and 3 lances fired simultaneously, and the rock formation exploded in a shower of plasma-heated stone, and the soldier who had pointed made a satisfied clicking sound. Then something hit him from behind. Whiskey had circled the entire patrol in the time it took them to fire 3 shots, and he came in from the north, the one direction none of them were watching, and he targeted the soldier's legs because the legs were where the chitin armor was thinnest at the joints, and his claws, gene-enhanced and harder than natural, keratin and sharp enough to score metal, raked across the back of the soldier's knee joint, and the soldier buckled and fell, and Whiskey was on its chest before it hit the ground, and going for the antenna cluster on the left side of its head. The antennae were sensory organs and communication arrays, and losing them was like losing an arm and an ear at the same time. And the soldier's scream when Whiskey tore them free was a frequency so high and so raw that the jungle went completely silent for 3 full seconds. And then Whiskey was gone again. 9 soldiers left, and then 8, because one of them stumbled into the sinkhole that Whiskey had found during his perimeter sweep, and fell 3 meters into loose rock, and shattered both its front legs, and lay at the bottom, calling for help, while its squadmates tried to figure out how to reach it without falling in themselves. Skirix made the decision to abandon it. 7 soldiers now, and the sub-commander was burning through his tactical options faster than he was burning through his troops, and nothing in his training or his experience across 12 star systems had prepared him for an enemy like this, an enemy that was too small to hit, and too fast to track, and too stubborn to scare, and that seemed to know exactly where they were at all times, while they could not find it, even when it was close enough to touch. A plasma bolt caught Whiskey on his left flank as he crossed a gap between 2 fallen trees. The bolt was a glancing hit, not a direct strike, but it burned through his outer fur and scorched the skin beneath, and the pain was enormous and immediate and white-hot, and any normal animal would have collapsed or fled or curled up to die. Whiskey stumbled and rolled and came up running, and the burned skin on his flank crackled and wept fluid, and he did not slow down, not even a little. And something in his chest that was deeper than pain and older than fear pushed him forward, because the child was still sleeping 50 meters behind him, and if he stopped, there was nothing between her and 12 alien soldiers who had come to take her away. He found the fungal pods, the fat, pale clusters he had marked during his perimeter sweep, the ones that burst and released burning spores, and he ran directly through them, and they exploded around him in a cloud of caustic white powder, and his micro-armor weave protected his skin, and his enhanced respiratory system filtered most of the spores, but he did not breathe easily, and his eyes burned. But the two soldiers chasing him ran into the cloud at full speed, and they had no such protection. And the spores hit their compound eyes, and their exposed mandible joints, and their breathing membranes, and both soldiers went down, choking and clawing at their own faces. Skirix watched this from 30 meters back, and for the first time in his military career, he felt something he had never felt before. He felt hunted. "Sub-Commander," one of his remaining soldiers said, and its voice was barely controlled, "we should call for aerial support." Skirix reached for his comm unit. It was gone. The housing on his belt where the comm unit had been mounted was empty. The mounting clips were bent outward as if something had pried them open, and he stared at the empty space and tried to remember the last time something had been close enough to touch him, and he could not remember, because he had never felt it happen. The animal had taken his communications equipment, and he had not even noticed. 5 soldiers left, and then 4, because Whiskey dropped from a tree onto the back of another and rode it to the ground like a man riding a bucking horse, and his jaws found the gap between helmet and thorax again, and when the soldier's squad mate tried to shoot him, the plasma bolt hit its own comrade instead. Left, pause. 2, 1. The last 2 fled into the jungle in different directions, and Whiskey let them go, because they were running away from the child, and that was the only direction he cared about. And through all of this, through every scream and every plasma bolt, and every desperate clash of claw against chitin, Alara Vasquez slept in the cargo pod, wrapped in her silver blanket with her thumb near her mouth, and her breath making small clouds in the cool air. She murmured once, and rolled onto her other side and pulled the blanket tighter. She dreamed about her mother's kitchen, and the smell of bread baking, and the sound of rain on a tin roof. 50 meters away, the jungle floor was scorched and stained, and the air smelled like ozone and blood and burned chitin. And Whiskey stood at the edge of a small clearing, with plasma burns on his flank, and a blade cut across his shoulder that was bleeding steadily, and one eye half swollen shut. Clearing stood Skirix, alone, his plasma lance trembling in his primary hands, and his secondary arms hanging broken at his sides, and his compound eyes wide and fixed on the small, bleeding, snarling creature that stood between him and the mission objective. He had fought wars across 12 systems, and he had killed humans, and he had killed things much larger and much more dangerous than this animal, and he had never once in his entire career felt the urge to run. He felt it now. Whiskey did not charge, and he did not growl, and he did not posture. He just stood there and bled and watched and waited, and that was worse than anything. He did not decide to run the way a commander decides to retreat, with tactical reasoning and calculated withdrawal. He simply turned, and his legs moved, and the jungle swallowed him, and he did not stop until his lungs burned, and his broken arms screamed, and he could no longer hear the low rumbling snarl of the creature he had left behind. He was found 4 hours later by a Vrethkai extraction team on the northern ridge, dehydrated and bleeding from 6 different wounds, and missing both his secondary arm's tactical plating, and staring at nothing with his compound eyes locked open, in a way that the extraction medic had only seen in soldiers who had survived orbital bombardments. They brought him to the patrol ship, and cleaned his wounds, and sat him in front of Fleet Captain Ithara for debriefing, and what followed was the most difficult conversation of his military career. 12 soldiers, Ithara said, and her voice was flat and cold, and her mandibles barely moved. When she spoke, you took 12 soldiers to retrieve 1 human child, and you are telling me that all 12 were neutralized by a single animal. Yes, Fleet Captain, an animal that weighs, according to the bioscan data, approximately 12 kilograms. Yes, Fleet Captain. Ithara leaned forward, and her compound eyes reflected the blue light of the tactical display behind her, and she studied Skirix's face for signs of deception or madness, or both. "Describe it again," she said. And Skirix did. He described the speed and the silence, and the way it used the terrain like a weapon, and the way it targeted weak points in their armor, with a precision that suggested either intelligence or an instinct so refined that the difference did not matter. And he described the way it kept circling back, always circling back, to position itself between the patrol and the crash site where the child was sleeping. And he described its eyes. "To kill us," Skirix said, and his voice dropped to something quiet and hollow. It was fighting to keep us away from the child, and it did not care what that cost it. I saw it take a plasma hit to the flank, and it did not even flinch. It just kept coming. It would have fought until every drop of blood had left its body, and it would have kept fighting after that if the bones in its jaw still worked. Yathara was silent for a long time. "Is a human pet?" she said finally, but the certainty had left her voice. "No, fleet captain," Skirix said, and he looked at her with eyes that had seen something they could not unsee. "It is not a pet. It is something else. It is something humans built because they knew that one day something would come for their children, and they wanted to make sure that whatever came would regret it." Yathara dismissed him and sat alone in the briefing room for 17 minutes, and then she opened a classified file and began reading. Planet below dawn was breaking. The first light came through the jungle canopy in shafts of gold and amber, and it touched the bioluminescent plants, and their glow faded like candles in the morning. And the sounds of the night creatures gave way to the sounds of the day creatures, soft warbling calls, and the rustle of wings, and the distant crash of water over rocks. Elara woke up slowly. She stretched and yawned, and rubbed her eyes, and looked around the cargo pod, and everything was the same as when she had fallen asleep, except that Whiskey was lying beside her, and he had not been there when she last remembered, and he looked different. He looked tired. His fur was matted and dark in places, and there was a raw red mark along his left side, and his shoulder had a cut on it that had stopped bleeding, but left a crusty brown trail through his silver-white fur, and one of his eyes was puffy and half-closed. Elara sat up, and her face crumpled with concern. "Got in a fight," she said, and it was not a question, because the evidence was right there on his body. Whiskey looked at her and made a small sound, a huff through his nose, and his tail moved once. Elara tore a strip from the bottom of her already ruined dress, and wet it with water from a cracked supply bottle she found in one of the crates, and she dabbed at the cut on his shoulder with the gentle clumsiness of a child who had watched her mother tend to scraped knees, but had never done it herself. "Mom says fighting is bad," she told him as she worked, "but I think you're brave." Whiskey held still and let her clean the wound, even though it stung, and even though every instinct in his body was telling him to pull away. Because the child was touching him with soft hands, and speaking in a soft voice, and his conditioning recognized this as pack-bonding behavior. And pack-bonding behavior was to be allowed and encouraged at all times. Ration bar with him, breaking off pieces and holding them out on her flat palm, the way she had seen people feed horses in picture books. And he ate most of it because he was very hungry, and because the protein and sugar hit his depleted system like fuel hitting an engine. Outside the cargo pod, the ravine was quiet, but not peaceful. The ground was scarred with plasma burns, and the thorn thicket to the east was flattened, and there were marks on the trees that looked like claw marks, and other marks that looked like something much worse, and the air had a faint chemical smell that did not belong to the jungle. Elara noticed none of this, because she was focused on getting a piece of ration bar out of Whiskey's ear fur where he had smeared it while eating too fast. Then the sky broke open. The sound came first, a deep rolling thunder that shook the trees and sent birds scattering in every direction, and then the light, a brilliant white streak that split the orange, morning sky from horizon to zenith. And Elara grabbed Whiskey and held him tight, and looked up through the canopy with wide, terrified eyes. But this was not a crash. This was an arrival. The TCS Resolve dropped out of faster-than-light travel and entered Farath 7 orbit like a hammer coming down on an anvil. A Terran rapid-response cruiser with enough firepower to slag a continent and enough Marines to take one back. And it had come because 3 hours ago a subdermal distress beacon had activated on the planet's surface, and the beacon was registered to a Colonial Defense Corps biodefense unit, and the Corps took care of its own, even the ones with 4 legs. The Vrethkai patrol fleet saw the Resolve arrive, and they knew immediately that the equation had changed, because a Vrethkai patrol fleet was built for raiding and enslaving and running, not for fighting a Terran heavy cruiser at close range. And Fleet Captain Yathara ordered an immediate withdrawal. Her ships began pulling away from orbit, even as the first Marine dropship screamed down through the atmosphere. 4 dropships hit the jungle floor around the crash site within 18 minutes of the Resolve's arrival, and the Marines that poured out of them were armored and armed and moving with the cold efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this scenario. Sergeant First Class Dominic Reeves led the first squad into the ravine, and he followed the beacon signal down the slope and through the trees, and what he found along the way made him slow his pace and then stop entirely. Plasma scoring on the rocks and trees, not human weapons, but Vrethkai, and chitin fragments scattered in the undergrowth, pieces of armor and pieces of things that had been wearing armor, and a sinkhole with drag marks at its edge, and a thorn thicket that looked like a war zone, and everywhere, the signs of a fight that had been brutal and close and utterly one-sided in a way that made no sense given the forces involved. He found a Vrethkai soldier's antenna cluster lying in the dirt next to a scent mark on a tree. He found claw marks on kitten plating that had been designed to stop small arms fire. He found the fungal pod clearing where 2 soldiers had gone down choking, and the ground was still dusted white with spores. And at the center of all of it, at the quiet, still center of a 50-meter radius of absolute carnage, he found the cargo pod. He stepped inside and saw a 6-year-old girl sitting cross-legged on the floor, with a tattered silver blanket around her shoulders, and a battered, blood-stained honey badger asleep in her lap. And she looked up at him with wide brown eyes, and said the first thing that came to her mind. "Are you here to take us home?" Reeves had served 14 years in the Colonial Marines, and he had seen combat on 6 worlds, and he had carried wounded soldiers through fire. Never once cried on a mission. He came close. "Yeah, kid," he said, and his voice was steady, even if his hands were not. "We're here to take you home." Behind him the squad's xenobiologist was standing at the edge of the clearing, and turning in a slow circle, and counting the signs of engagement, the kills, and the maimings, and the traps, and the diversions. And she pulled up the bioscan data from the cargo pod, and confirmed what she already knew. 1 child. 1 honey badger. And the honey badger had never moved more than 50 meters from the child. Not once. "Sergeant," she said quietly, when Reeves emerged carrying Alara, with whiskey limping at his heels. It stayed within perimeter distance the entire time. Every engagement, every kill, every maneuver, it always came back to her. It built a kill zone around a sleeping 6-year-old and defended it against a full Vrethkai patrol, and it won. Reeves looked down at Whiskey, slightly to one side, and bleeding from wounds that should have killed a normal animal 3 times over, and whose one good eye was still scanning the tree line as if the fight might not be over. "Yeah," Reeves said, "I can see that." A medic approached to take Whiskey for treatment, and Alara's arms tightened around the badger, and her eyes went wide and fierce. "No," she said, "he stays with me." The medic looked at Reeves. Reeves shook his head slowly. "Don't," he said. "Just don't treat them together." They carried Alara onto the dropship, and she sat on the medical bench, with Whiskey on her lap, and the medic cleaned and bandaged them both side by side. the girl with her scrapes and bruises, and the honey badger with his plasma burns and blade cuts, and the dozen other wounds he had collected in the night. Whiskey lay across Alara's legs, and his breathing was shallow, and his body was heavy with exhaustion and pain. Kept him running for hours, was finally draining away, and leaving nothing behind but the warm weight of the child above him, and the steady sound of her heartbeat. He closed his eyes. For the first time since the crash, he closed his eyes. And Alara held him and whispered into his matted fur words that he could not understand, but that his body understood perfectly. "You're safe now," she said. "I've got you." It was a Vreth Kai after-action document, classified at the highest level of their military intelligence network, and it was never supposed to leave the encrypted servers of Fleet Captain Yathara's command ship. But someone copied it, and someone else forwarded it, and within 72 hours, it had spread across every diplomatic channel and intelligence network and xenobiological forum in the known galaxy. The document was titled Engagement Report, Verath 7 Surface Retrieval, Sub-Commander Skirix, 4th Patrol Division, and it detailed in clinical military language how a 12-soldier armed patrol had been deployed to retrieve a single juvenile human from a crash site, and how that patrol had been systematically destroyed by a 12-kilogram Terran animal operating alone and without weapons or tools or any form of external support. The galaxy read it. The galaxy read it again, and the galaxy had questions. The Kelvari, a species of tall philosophical herbivores who had always considered humans to be charmingly primitive, convened an emergency session of their Academy of Xenobiology, and spent 3 days debating whether Mellivora capensis qualified as a sapient species, and whether the Terran practice of bonding with such creatures constituted a form of military alliance that should be regulated under interstellar law. P. The Drothi, a reptilian species known for their pragmatic approach to warfare, simply added a new entry to their tactical database under the heading Terran Asymmetric Threats, and flagged it with their highest caution rating, which was a symbol that translated roughly to "Do not engage unless you are prepared to lose everything." P. The Morvathi, a collective intelligence that communicated through shared chemical signals, released a brief statement that said simply, "We have always suspected that humans are more dangerous than they appear. We did not suspect that their animals are worse." Vreth Kai, who had started all of this by raiding a human colony, found themselves in the deeply uncomfortable position of having their military reputation shredded, not by a human fleet, or a human army, or a human weapon of mass destruction, but by something that looked like an angry pillow with claws. The Galactic Council convened a special session. The chamber was enormous, a vast circular hall carved from the living rock of Station Prime, with tiered seating for representatives of 412 species, and a speaking floor at the center, where the light fell in a single bright column. And it was full, because everyone wanted to hear the humans explain themselves. The representative who stepped into the light was Ambassador Adaizi Okafor, a tall woman with close-cropped silver hair and calm dark eyes, and the kind of quiet presence that made rooms go still when she entered them. She listened patiently while the Vrethkai diplomatic attaché, a nervous creature named Frix, read a formal protest into the record. The deployment of bioengineered attack fauna against sentient species constitutes a violation of the Galactic Convention on Proportional Response, Frix declared, and his mandibles clicked rapidly, which was a sign of either conviction or anxiety, and in this case it was both. "We demand that the Terran government cease the production and deployment of weaponized animals, and submit to an independent inspection of all biodefense programs." The chamber murmured. Ambassador Okafor waited until the murmur died, and then she spoke. "I want to make sure I understand the complaint," she said, and her voice was warm and even and carried to every seat in the hall without effort. Your government sent a raiding fleet to a human colony world. You bombarded our orbital defenses. You scattered our evacuation transports. You sent armed soldiers into the jungle to capture a 6-year-old girl for your labor markets. And your formal complaint to this council is that the 6-year-old girl's pet fought back. The chamber went very quiet. Sergeant Whiskey, Okafor continued, and she used the name with the same weight she would give a decorated general, is classified as a perimeter defense animal. He was assigned to Colony Station Vareth 7 as part of our standard frontier security package. He was not deployed against your soldiers. He was not commanded to engage. He was not given orders of any kind because he is an animal, and animals do not take orders in the way this council seems to imagine. She paused and looked around the chamber at the hundreds of alien faces watching her. He was guarding a child, she said, a sleeping child who had survived a shuttle crash and was alone and afraid in the dark on a hostile world. And when your soldiers came for that child, he did what his instincts and his conditioning and his bond with that child compelled him to do. Her and harm. And he did not move. She let that settle. If your soldiers did not want to meet Sergeant Whiskey, she said, and her voice did not rise, but something in it hardened like steel cooling, then they should not have come for the child. The Vrethkai attaché opened his mandibles to respond, and then closed them, and then opened them again, and then sat down. The vote to dismiss the Vrethkai protest was nearly unanimous. After the session, Ambassador Okafor gave a brief statement to the gathered press corps, and it was this statement, more than the leaked report, and more than the council session, that burned itself into the collective memory of every species in the galaxy. I think there is a misunderstanding about humans that I would like to correct, she said, and the recording drones hovered around her, and every screen on every station, in every system, carried her face and her voice. Other species look at us, and they see a mid-tier predator from a mid-tier world, not the strongest or the fastest or the most armored, and they wonder how we built an interstellar civilization. She smiled, and it was not a threatening smile, but it was not a comfortable one either. The answer is that we do not survive alone. We never have. For 10,000 years we have walked beside other creatures, and we have fed them and sheltered them and loved them. And in return they have guarded our homes and herded our food and warned us of danger. And yes, when something comes in the night for our children, they have fought for us. She looked directly into the nearest recording drone. Humans do not only fight for themselves, she said. Everything we love fights for us, and we love very easily. We love dogs and cats and horses and birds, and yes, we love honey badgers. And every single one of those creatures will go through fire for us, not because we command them to, but because we were kind to them. And a warm place to sleep, and a hand on their head when they were afraid. She paused. So let me be very clear to every species listening to this. If you come for our people, and you are not facing our people alone, you are facing everything that has ever loved us, and I promise you, that is a longer list than you think. 3 months later, on a quiet homestead, on the colony world of Nova Terra, a girl named Alara Vasquez sat in a sunlit garden and turned the pages of a picture book about Earth animals. She was healed now. The bruises were gone and the scrapes had faded, and she had a new dress that was blue with white flowers on it. And her mother was inside, making lunch, and through the open window came the smell of bread baking and the sound of music playing softly on the kitchen radio. At her feet, in a patch of warm grass, lay Sergeant Whiskey. He was scarred now. The plasma burn on his flank had healed into a patch of bare pink skin that his fur would never quite cover, and the blade cut on his shoulder had left a thin white line through his silver coat, and his left eye still squinted slightly when he was tired. But he was alive, and he was fed, and he was warm, and the child was close, and the child was safe. On his collar, which he tolerated only because Alara had picked it out, and it was purple, which was her favorite color, hung a small metal disc stamped with the Colonial Defense Corps insignia, and the words, Medal of Valor, Sergeant Whiskey, Biodefense Unit K9 MB7, for conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of instinct. He had tried to chew it off 4 times. Alara kept putting it back. He was officially retired from the Defense Corps, permanently reassigned as Alara Vasquez's personal companion animal by order of the colonial governor, who had signed the paperwork with what witnesses described as a very dusty office that was making his eyes water. Across the galaxy, in the intelligence centers of 40 different species, a file was being updated and cross-referenced and flagged at the highest priority level. The file on Terran companion fauna, and the specific subsection dedicated to Mellivora capensis, which had grown from a single paragraph to 47 pages in the 3 months since Verax 7. And in the command ships of the Vrethkai fleet, a new standing order had been issued and distributed to every patrol unit in every system where humans had established colonies. If biosigns indicate the presence of Terran fauna near a human settlement or human young, do not engage, withdraw and reassess. The fauna are not pets, the fauna are not decorative, the fauna are the first line of defense, and they do not negotiate. Alara did not know about any of this. She knew that she had a funny-looking dog who smelled bad and ate too much and tried to chew his metal, and who slept at the foot of her bed every single night without fail. Who watched the door when she slept, and who watched the windows when she played, and who pressed his nose into her hand whenever she was sad. She turned another page in her picture book and found the entry for honey badgers, and she read the caption out loud in the slow, careful way of a child who was still learning big words. The honey badger is widely considered the most fearless animal on Earth. She looked down at Whiskey. He was lying on his back in the grass, with his paws in the air, and his tongue hanging out of the side of his mouth, and he was snoring. "I believe it," she said, and she scratched his belly, and he made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a growl, and his back leg kicked twice, and she laughed. Inside the house, her mother heard the laugh and smiled and turned the bread in the oven. The sun moved across the garden, and the shadows grew long, and the afternoon turned gold and warm, and eventually Alara fell asleep in the grass, with her picture book open on her chest, and the page still turned to the entry about honey badgers. Whiskey rolled onto his stomach. He looked at her. He looked at the garden fence. He looked at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening blue, distant and cold and full of things that might one day come this way. He lay down beside her, with his chin on his paws, and one ear rotated toward the fence, and one ear rotated toward the sky, and his one good eye was half open and steady. The stars were quiet tonight, but he was listening. He was always listening.